it's Reese here, and today I'm going to be talking about one of everyone's most favourite things in higher education, group work. So how do you sort of make group work? And how can you sort of figure out sort of the logistics within the team and what are the benefits that you're going to get from it? In this video, I'm going to reflect on some of the challenges and some of the strategies to make group work for you. So often one of the key things that comes up in terms of group work is why are we doing it in the first place, right? So if you're doing an essay, for example, if you're doing an exam, they're sort of more obvious assessment types, right? They can test your understanding. But group work tasks are more difficult. They are forcing you to work with other people. They're forcing you to essentially, to some degree, put the stake of your work in other people's hands. So why do we do this? What is the value of this? Well, throughout life you're going to have to work in teams. You're going to have to work with people you know and with people you don't. And it's really fantastic sort of training in a sense to be able to understand those mechanisms of how you work with other people, how you organise, how you communicate. A group work task is something that is really, really valuable, and because it teaches skills and different skills from, say, an essay-based assessment, a sort of an individualised assessment, and they all add up. They're sort of useful skills to hone, I think, because they are essentially setting you up for a life, a reality, in which you're going to have to work with other people. So one of the key things that you need to learn when you're doing group work, and this is something that you're doing true of any assessment, any sort of thing where you need to sort of produce an output at the end, is questions of organisation. And the organisation here is particularly difficult because you're working with other people. So you need to organise in a way that works for yourself but also works for your team. So questions that I would ask yourself: what are the deadlines that you're working to? Is it the case that your group has to produce one thing at the end of a certain period? Do they have to produce multiple things at multiple points throughout the period? Knowing those deadlines sort of immediately and knowing them early on, and normally if you're given a group task at higher education, you'll know those deadlines, you'll be given those. But that is really, really useful because then that sort of gives you the time frame in which you're working. Then sort of the logistics of your team, so sort of working out with your team things like how will you communicate. So are you going to set up a group chat? Are you going to have sort of regular meetings in person? Are you going to sort of are there points which are all free, looking at each other's timetables and figuring out where exactly the group works fits in? All of these things, figuring out how you guys are going to sort of work together early on is really useful. And I've done this, so I've taught on a module. I taught on a module that was about sort of teaching team skills. I would work with my group and I would book them a regular room, say once a week. I would sort of help them. There was a team space that some of them like to use. All these things, it doesn't matter, providing it works for your team. And then questions of how often you're going to communicate. And again, basing this around deadlines, basing this around sort of logical things in the sort of the structure of whatever your project is. And then something that I think is really useful is to figure out what are the essentials. And so it's often been the case of teamwork where people sort of focus on things that, broadly speaking, don't overly matter. And what do I mean by this? So sort of details like you're asked to produce a poster, say. Members of the team will spend potentially inordinate amounts of time on doing sort of this sort of nice graphic designs and colour schemes and all that sort of stuff, which is important, but sort of in the grand scheme of things, less so. So working out sort of the key things that need to be addressed. There are sort of, in every project, there are things that are essential, and there are things that are kind of almost nice to have, if that makes sense. And figure those out with your team as well and sort of organise accordingly. It might be the case that you want to make a plan, it might be the case that you don't, but again, having those conversations early on, and as early on really as you can, knowing of course that anything is flexible, but having a sort of a sense of structure very early on is really key, I would say. So another thing that is key, I think, in team projects is figuring out who is going to do what. So there will be certain things you'll need to do, there will be certain outputs at the end, but it's not often the case that everyone needs to do the same thing. The idea of a good team project is one in which different people contribute things, and the things that they contribute make the end output greater than the sum of their parts. So there are a load of resources figuring out sort of different team roles and all that sort of stuff. And really, what happens there kind of depends on what the project is. But what I would say is sort of essential for any project is appointing a leader, having someone who is in charge, someone who will coordinate and sort of keep things ticking over, right? This person wants to be reliable. They want to be someone who is sort of essentially going to keep the show on the road. Having a good leader is really, really effective and really, really, I think, essential to making team projects work. So who can do that? Who can do that? And this is very much a question that leads on to the next thing. Who is good at different things? If you have, say, a team of, let's pick a random number, 6, say, they won't all be brilliant at everything. One may be a natural leader, one may be the natural sort of artist, one may be the natural organiser. Whatever it is, play to the strengths of your team. And again, it's the open conversation, it's the dialogue that figures this out. When you know what jobs need to be done, some people will be better at them, some people will want to do certain things, and some people want to do other things. Figuring out who will do what is a mixture of things. It's figuring out who would be good at doing certain aspects. It's figuring out who has the time to be able to do things. You don't want to give jobs to someone who's got an exam the next week where their mind will be elsewhere. So sort of figuring out sort of who is most time appropriate for tasks. And then making sure that everyone is aware of what everyone is doing, by and large. So you're sort of doing your individual bits, and you're doing bits that probably play to your strengths. Although you can push yourself if there's jobs need to be done that sort of is no one's obvious forte. But then making sure that everyone sort of knows how the contributions are going. There's nothing more frustrating in a team project than a teammate who goes AWOL when they're meant to be doing things and you don't know. So that sort of open communication, that open dialogue is really, really helpful. So having someone who sort of is vaguely, broadly in charge of it, and having people sort of doing specific aspects of the team project are normally the best ways to make them work. Of course, as with any sort of work, there will always be difficulties in team projects. Always. Some of these are sort of part of the process to be expected, right? So you'll sort of schedule things and you won't be able to do them. Time pressures will sort of force you to reevaluate your plans. That sort of stuff is normal. But what is always the top recurring issue, something that always comes up in every time I've ever known anyone do a group project, in all my years in higher education, is this. What happens if people on the team don't pull their weight? What happens if they say they'll do stuff and they won't, and you're worried it will adversely affect you, and it will adversely affect the project as a whole? There is no easy, obvious answer to this. As I say, sort of the open communication lines of dialogue are really, really helpful from the off. Sort of hoping that will mitigate against the issue occurring in the first place. But then, if it does, what do you do? And the question is kind of the same thing of sort of what would you do in a real world scenario. If I'm in the office and someone doesn't come in but work needs to be done, we split work around and we delegate it. Sort of people who have less stuff, pull their socks up and help out. So sort of figuring out how to respond to this thing, and this is something that sort of I've never known it not happen in sort of any group assessment, is that at least one team will have team members that don't do anything. Of course, often we mitigate against this by sort of enabling things like peer assessment, whereby you can rate people based on how much they've contributed or not. I would say in a sort of higher education sense, especially in an assessment sense, so if there's group assessments, and ask questions of sort of what support is available. Does your team have mentors? Are there module leaders who can sort of give advice? Are you expected to engage with wider people? Knowing sort of that although your team is sort of a unit, there is likely to be many other sources of support that you can turn to. So is there anyone there who can help out? Is there anyone you can look to for sort of extra help there? And it's worth stating as well, challenges are not necessarily bad in their own. Challenges are never particularly bad in their own right. And it's often the case now that group work comes with sort of reflective elements, sort of what happened when you hit a bump in the road. What did you and your team do? And often when there are issues, it can force real inventive solutions. So it can force your team to be innovative. It might force you to refocus your efforts elsewhere to something that you have more time for. It might be the case that if you've lost someone with a particular skill, someone else is forced to step up to the plate and sort of develop that skill. All of these things are valuable in their own right, and sort of you can reflect on sort of things, how you've responded to challenges, because often that is where sort of particularly rich things happen. So definitely hold that in your head, this thing of sort of challenges normally occur, and in many cases can often kind of be sort of baked into the sort of the premise of the group assessment, but it's what you do in response to them that is the key thing. So there you are, some thoughts and reflections on group work. I hope this has proven useful. I know it's something that is not everyone's favourite assessment type, in terms of sort of having to deal with other people and the fact that sort of your fate is not entirely within your own hands. But nonetheless, it is very rich and rewarding, and if you can get it right, and if you can work with people who are also committed to getting it right, then it is really, really fantastic. So anyway, yes, this is my video. Hopefully this has been of some use, and please do comment below if you have any other thoughts on sort of how to make group work work. And thank you very much for watching. Make sure to like, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment if there's other videos you'd like me to make. Otherwise, thank you very, very much for watching. I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.